In part 1, we talked about sanding this chair and getting it ready to put some color on it. And in part 2, the color we're going to use comes from stain. My personal favorite is oil-based stain. I like it because it doesn't fade, goes on very easily, and provides much more flexibility when you're putting on top coats. This is also the time to think about the finishing process. I feel that the finishing process should take at least as long as it did to construct your furniture. This is not the time to rush. When you're putting on a stain, you're also going to find that it's nice to use a small sample piece to make sure that the stain matches the color that you're looking for and also goes on well without blotching. Because this is a purchase product, this is a chair that I bought for this, I found that I don't have any of that scrap. But there is a good place to find a test area on this chair, and let me show you where that is. Now here on the bottom of the chair is the perfect place to do a test. No one will ever see this. The wood is the same as the wood used to the rest of the chair, and you'll be able to tell whether or not the stain goes on well, whether or not it blotches, and some of the other issues that go with it. Perfect spot. What I'll always do to keep from having a problem with the stain leaking all over the place is take an awl and punch a couple of small holes around the inside ring of that can. That will allow any of the stain that kind of comes up in there to leak back in. And don't worry about it, it won't affect the seal. The seal's on the outside and inside edges, it's not in the bottom of that. Now I want you to stir the stain, and I want to stir it well because stain is pigment-based, the oil is, and hopefully you'll be able to see this is what the pigment looks like sitting at the bottom of that can. And it's important to make sure that that pigment is well stirred so it's in suspension and it's not sitting in the bottom. All right, so we're all done during the stirring here. As you can see, there's no pigments left at the bottom of this stick. And now we'll talk about a couple of different application methods or tools. The first is a rag. A lot of people like to use this, no problem at all. Second is a foam brush. Picks up an awful lot of material, lays out an awful lot of material at one time, actually works fairly well. And the last is what they call a chip brush. This does a real nice job and kind of blends the three techniques together. And you can use them separately or all together, and to be honest, in many cases I wind up using all three of them. All right, now to do a little test sample on the bottom of this chair, I'm going to take the stain. In this case I'm going to use the brush. There's an awful lot of little areas in here that make it tough to use just a rag. And I'm going to real lightly put a couple of lines of finish in here. As soon as I put them on, I'll take a rag and wipe them down a bit, just so I can see whether or not the stain is penetrated well. And this then brings up a little discussion. If the stain penetrates perfectly and if it looks nice and even across, although remember there are different boards in here, so it's not going to look perfect, as long as it looks fairly even, I'm going to stay with that technique. If it turns out that the boards themselves are taking in an awful lot of stain in one spot and not in another, that's called blotching. And what I may want to do is change my technique there. There are two different ways to do that. One is to use a gel stain, which will help reduce some of that blotching. The second is to condition the wood by using what they call a wood conditioner, and then use a stain over the top of that. We'll give you a little bit more information about those later. But what I'm going to do right now is just use the stain. As you can see, the finish looks pretty good. It comes out pretty evenly, and I'm pretty comfortable that what happened on the bottom of this chair is also going to happen on the sides. So now that I'm done, I'll turn the chair over, and let's start working on the real surface. Okay, now you'll continue to stain this chair and use the same techniques that you used on the sample side. Remember the bottom side of this chair seat. But I want to show you a couple things. When you stain the top of this, you get a nice look. But as you come around the face, remember that end grain problem being a little bit more porous than the surface. What I asked you to do in video 1 was to double sand. So we sanded this to 220. We're sanding the front of this to 320 and then to 400. The stain on here, because this has been sanded a little bit finer, should approximate the look on the top. So we'll put the stain on here. Now one of the application methods is to put it across the grain along and wipe it with the grain. It's a good idea to go back and forth to give a nice even coverage. And I'll wipe this off, and then I want to go across the face of this and show you how nicely we'll get this blend between a stained edge that's been sanded to 220 and an end grain that's been sanded to 400. And look at how nice the color is here and how much lighter it is here. If this had not been sanded to 400 grit, it would have been markedly darker and you'd see a pronounced line across that end grain. Really nice blend. we're putting a little stain on the leg side here, and you're feeling pretty comfortable about your abilities. And then when you go to wipe it off, you find something like this. Now that's a glue spot. Usually looks like a fingerprint, surprisingly enough. And what happens is you didn't pick that up when you first looked at your chair and did all your sanding. This is not the time to panic. Take a razor knife like this. Actually use that razor knife and sand off the glue on that spot instead of trying to come back with it with sandpaper. And let's see what that looks like. And there you go. Now it's nice to be able to find a technique to remove that glue spot after the fact, but to be honest, you're much better off to try and find them before you start putting stain on. Generally what I do when I build a project is I'll take a little mineral spirits on a rag and I'll wipe the entire project down with it. Glue shows up very well with mineral spirits over the top as a slight shiny area because the mineral spirits couldn't penetrate in that spot. Allow the mineral spirits to dry, sand that area, and re-tap it with mineral spirits until you finally find the glue is gone. That way when you're staining a project, you don't get surprised. Okay, now you've finished staining your chair. Let me give you a couple of more pointers here. If you find that after the stain is on here that it's just a little bit darker than you wanted in a couple of spots, this is an oil-based stain. So just take a little bit of mineral spirits while the stain is still wet, real lightly wipe over those spots and you will have light in that color. If you want the color a little darker, it's important to let this dry overnight. Give it a good 6 or 8 hours of drying and come back and apply the second coat of stain the same as you did the first. Oil-based stains penetrate very well. The odds are that you won't need much more than a second coat to darken it. And finally, before putting on a top coat, allow this to dry at least 24 hours. Temperature and humidity conditions change a lot. It also changes the guidelines associated with drying times. Let it dry 24 hours to make sure that you're not going to have a problem with applying a top coat to it. And lastly, from a safety standpoint, the rags that you use to wipe off this stain, if left in a ball like this, can cause a problem. They will self-combust. So open the rag up, let it air dry, and when it's finally dry and hard, then you can throw it away.